So this is going to be the third installment of my Maps of Meaning Mondays, or Mo Meaning Mondays, as I like to say. A little bit of housekeeping before I begin, as Sam Harris says. My computer actually failed to start this morning. I think the power supply is broken. So I ordered a new one, and that should get here by Tuesday or Wednesday. But right now I'm at a friend's house trying to record this. And it's a good thing I put everything on a Google PowerPoints instead of my hard drive. So I'm going to get to this picture I'm using as the first slide at the end. It's something I had an artist create a couple of years ago. But yeah, I'll get to that more at the end. So on to the third page of Maps of Meaning. I believe first I have a little recap of pages 1 and 2. So I'm going to do this every single time until it gets too cumbersome to do. But hopefully I can recap the pages, and simplify them as we get further on in the book. And it seems, the writing gets a lot better so far between pages 1 and 3, oddly enough. And it seems like, of course, to begin, it's kind of complicated. But as he's moving forward, it seems to be more and more clear, which is a good sign. But maybe some of you, or most of you, have already read the book, and you can disagree with that. Maybe things get more complicated. But so a recap as to how things start. Peterson starts the book with the idea that the world can be construed as a forum for action and a place of objects, a place of things. And he says a complete worldview needs to incorporate both of these things. And that's where I believe I noted that the Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson debates, on their first Vancouver debate, was all about page number 1, so it seemed to me. And this idea of the world as a forum for action versus a place of things, and to the extent, it is one or both of those things. And then Vancouver debate number 2 seemed to be about page 2, oddly enough, of Maps of Meaning. So, anyway, myth provides us with the world as a forum for action with meaning. Without the meaning that myth and narrative provide us, it would be hard to discover and construe all of that and build it up as individuals, given our short lifespans and our limited experience in the world. Science provides us with the world of objects as sense data, and I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Confusion arises between things only because their domains are not sufficiently discriminated. Now, when I say confusion arises between things, I mean between the idea of the world as a forum for action and the idea of the world of things, or the world of objects. So, myth is for meaning, science is for objects, myth is for what ought to be, and science is for the question of what is. And so Peterson makes the point in pages, I think at the bottom of page 1, that there is confusion between religion and science, inasmuch as there is an insufficiently discriminated domain for each. Now, I don't know why he thinks their domains are insufficiently discriminated, because, well, maybe because some religious people believe that the Bible contains scientific facts, and some scientists believe that they have some kind of hold on ethics, on what you ought to do in the world. I mean, I guess that's the only reason why he would have to say that. But the reason why it seems curious to me is because I always learned, I guess you could say, the proper way of thinking about it, that religion, or the Bible, was not a science book. It predates science. So it never even occurred to me to look into the book as a science book. And when I was studying science in school, none of my teachers or professors really looked at it as a way to gain insight into ethics or how you should act in the world. So I never had that confusion. But now that I listen to Sam Harris more and more, I guess some people are very confused about that. So anyway, on page 2, Peterson goes on to say that he describes a child exploring her world. And so the child's mind searches out meaning and places this above sense data. Now he's saying he's making a scientific claim, I guess, or a psychological claim, and which I suppose he will be supporting later on in the book with some kind of studies, that the mind searches out meaning and it places that above the sense data that it is apprehending. Meaning is how to act in the world, and this is nested into a socio-cultural context, and he has that in his example. The child's interaction with her mother is sort of the first socio-cultural context that you put your actions into, and how you extract how to act in the world. You extract meaning between the objects you encounter and your social group. The meaning of an object is inextricably linked with the object itself as sense data. So I believe he goes on to say something about the natural mind, I think in page 3, which we're going to get into. But so far in page 2, I believe he's making the point that the child sees an object, and of course they apprehend it with sense data, but they also link the meaning of the object with that sense data. And so that child's mind, I believe, as he's trying to say, is the natural mind, is linking the two. There's not two modes of being or two worlds of meaning. There's just the data linked with the meaning. So I think I'm going to run through some of these slides just to show you the titles. It's From Subjective to Objective is my first slide. And if you ever looked at a book Peterson references a lot, what's it called? The History of the Unconscious, I believe. It's like a 700 or 800 page book. He's sort of going over that book, in one paragraph on this page. And I'm sure he unpacks that paragraph into other chapters of the book, but I can't wait to get to that. And then I would say, yes, there's a slide here about the natural mind. He goes over a paragraph about the natural mind. And then the hierarchy of knowing, which is something he's been trying to get to and stress with that example of the child. And then centuries of intellectual training is the last slide I'm going to do. So from subjective to objective, we are not yet as objective thinkers as we often think we are. Now, what I'm doing here is I'm not reading the page yet. I'm going over sort of some of the summary of it before I actually read it, and then I will read it, and I will explain that first thumbnail that first slide I had of the artwork. So we are not yet as objective thinkers as we often think we are. So we as modern people, perhaps Sam Harris and Matt Dillahunty, think that they have left the myth and the religious beliefs on the side of the road, and they are speeding down the freeway of reason and objective thinking. But in reality, human beings are much more emotional thinkers than they are rational thinkers. I think Eric Weinstein had an interesting point about this on the Akira the Don interview he did. And I believe he called it critical, instead of critical thinking, it was like critical emotion. And so instead of applying a critique to your rational thoughts, he thought about applying a critique to your emotional thoughts, your emotional way of looking at the world. And that could be very useful, where you critique your emotions and you try to understand how you feel about something, because how you feel about it is really 90% of how you're going to think about it with the top layer of your brain, with your cortex. And that's actually something interesting Elon Musk brought up on that podcast. I didn't get a chance to do it. I was having computer problems yesterday, but Elon Musk brought up how the limbic part of your brain is the old part of your brain. Let's say your animalistic parts, the parts you can see even in a lizard brain, seems to be the dominant part of your brain, where your cortex is in service to your limbic system. And it was an interesting point he was making to Rogan, and I should probably touch on that in another video. But I think this is also what Peterson's getting at here, is that we're not as rational as we like to think. We're not as objective as we like to think. We're more emotional and irrational than we would like. So people of sufficient representational status of our ideals and values, the values that protect us from the chaos of the unknown, people who embody those values, that's what I'm trying to say, they tend to invoke feelings of importance and meaning in us. And I believe he gives the example, well, he gives an example of like the Pope or a movie star or something like that. Yeah, there, it's in the next sentence there. This all seems rather irrational, fawning over a movie star or a pope, until you understand the underpinnings of why we do this, and this is what he's getting into. So, and this also falls into what I would figure happened in the second debate, I think, or was it the first? It was one of his first two debates with Sam Harris, that soccer is not just a game, it's a metaphor. And if you think back to, early humans, it might have been really important to have good aim, to be able to, let's say, move a rock and hit an animal on the head with it by throwing it, maybe with your arm or with a sling, or then you maybe evolve to have something like a spear or a bow and arrow eventually. The person who was able to have good aim and hit his target and not miss the target was celebrated, because he was the one who was bringing home, so to speak, the food. And without the food, you wouldn't survive. And you can see how that gets translated with the Jewish religion on sin being missing the mark. It's more of a bow and arrow reference, perhaps, but you're missing the mark. That's what sin ends up being linguistically, and how that translates into behavior. That, hunting and hitting the mark, doing the right thing, was providing for the tribe, and ensuring the survival of the tribe became the right thing. Missing the mark, not doing what you're supposed to do, was dangerous, not just for you yourself, but for the tribe. Maybe, they weren't going to get enough food, and so then people would start to die. So you could definitely see some really ancient underpinnings to this whole idea of missing the mark and being able to score the goal, and how games would develop from this as a cultural evolution from that, and why people enjoy it so much now, because it's part of our old brain, our old limbic system, about trying to stay well with the group, trying to be part of the group. Because if you were not in good standing with the group, that really meant death. And if you weren't providing for yourself and for the group, then the group as a whole may die as well. So, the group was watching you and you were watching the group, and that's why you could definitely see how these games developed. But I was sort of like Sam Harris years ago. When I was in high school, I was never a fan of sports like that. I was into more one-on-one sports like wrestling, and I did some golf for a little bit, but that was kind of boring. But wrestling was more of my thing. And I could never understand football or soccer or baseball. But the way Jordan Peterson explains it, it makes a lot of sense now. as I look back, let's say on my anthropology classes, the way he's explaining it, it makes a lot more sense. So anyway, so Jordan brings up the antique and the guitar of Elvis, and he's trying to point out to Sam that there's no objective value in those objects. It's all subjective value. It's the value that comes between people and the objects. It's not in the object. It's not in the person. It's between the people and the objects. And then he gets to the natural mind. And so this is concerned with a hierarchy of values, the top of which is meaning, the bottom which is sensory data. Presenting the modern, scientifically objectified, quote, object or thing to a naturally minded person would very likely be like presenting them with an empty shell, a husk of what used to mean something, what used to be significant. And I thought this was kind of interesting. It kind of reminds me of those people that they're finding in the Amazon rainforest that are sort of untouched from the modern world, and they can see a drone, and I think one of them tried to shoot it down with their bow and arrow. But you know, I think these are the types of people who are thinking with natural minds, and they're seeing the meaning and the object as one thing. They don't have that thing that happened to most of the world after the Enlightenment period, where we started separating object, its meaning from its sense data and so forth. And this kind of reminds me of a thing that comes up in William Blake in his mythological construction of the world. He calls the shell of the world the mundane shell, and it sort of reminds me of how Peterson says this husk, this empty shell. That's the mundane shell of Blake, and it contains all the errors of man. It separates us from eternity, so we can't kind of go through it, but the eternals from eternity can move through it into our, what he says is our vegetated earth, which makes a lot of sense. The earth is sort of dominated by plant life is what seems to work best on earth. The intersection of God with the material world is what Blake viewed as sort of that Jesus narrative. And then we come to the hierarchy of knowing. To know something, it must first provide you with an emotional impact. Then you sort out the sense data and the meaning, how to act in the world, proximal causes of this. At the top of this sorting out is meaning, or how to act in the world. And I think he keeps driving this point home over these first three pages. The form for action is your most important part of how to view the world. And you're constantly sorting out meaning, which is telling you how to act in the world. And then there comes the sense data, the world of objects, and that's, further organized as part of the object that has meaning. So there is what is, and here I have words, if you're just listening to this, I have words underlined and italicized. What is, that's sense data. And motivational relevance is what it means for you to do. There's what is as sense data, and motivational relevance, what it means for you to do. And I believe those are his exact words in the text, which we will get to. We need to know what something is, not to merely know what it is like, but to keep track of what it means, to understand what objects signify for our behavior. And I think he had a little bit of an odd sentence there that I had to read a couple of times. And the way I would put it is I added the word merely. It makes a little bit more sense for me to understand it. And I might do this when I read the passage at the end here. But I read it as it's not enough for us to merely know what it is like. I might have even added like to that. I'm not sure. We'll find out. So he's definitely stressing a hierarchy, as with Peterson. he's kind of got famous for that lobster hierarchy example. But there's a hierarchy sort of in everything. It's not just cultural, but it certainly is in our sociocultural understanding of the world and what motivates us to act and how we view meaning in the world. That's certainly part of it. So then at the end, he goes into centuries of intellectual training to develop minds and cultural understanding that separate an object's meaning from its sense properties. To regard real as something separable from relevant, this took hundreds of years of doing. Myth is not quite out of the mind, but science as a myth of being, quote, devoted to human progress sort of is at the top of everyone's modern mind. And scientists, he says, who, they can endlessly look at fruit flies in a jar, studying them and tirelessly do this mundane work. They're doing it because they have the story of science behind them. They have their own myth, and that is, quote, devoted to human progress. And that's very important to understand. And that's something I've been seeing over the last few years myself, that there's this myth that people who say they're objective scientific thinkers who've put aside religious beliefs and faith and all that kind of thing, but they have their own set of myths and stories that they find very important. And then at the end of this page, this third page, he sort of goes into a quote, I think, from Jung that's on the next page, and it's talking about alchemy and so forth, which is, of course, very relevant, because in the alchemist time, and I won't talk about this too much now, I'll save it for next week. In the alchemist time, the alchemist did not live in a world that was fully separated an object from its significance, from its meaning, from how it informed your action in the world. And I think I even got into that in my one of my recent videos called Jordan, Alchemist, Peterson, Sam, Dogma, Harris. I read a very lengthy quote from Jung's Aeon, and I understand that, reading something like this in a video format, reading is often the death of communication, but I do find that there's value in hearing the primary source material and hearing, what lies behind a lot of Jordan's thoughts on these matters from the primary source. He mentions Aeon, Jung's Collected Works, Volume 9, Part 2, I believe, many times. And so if I read a 10-page section, it took me far longer to read than I expected, and I'm not used to talking so much, so my voice is a little bit giving way, but I think it's still valuable to hear that, even if it took like 20 minutes to read. It was a really interesting part of the book, and I just figured, you might not have time to go through 800 pages of Jung's archetype writings, and him talking about alchemy and so forth, but I did that, and so I sort of did it for you. And maybe if you hear a few pages quoted, you'll have at least that knowledge. And my hope is that you might even pick up the book for yourself and read the whole thing if you haven't done so already. But I figured as a node in a network that I could spread some of the better bits that I find in these videos. So I think this was my last slide, and I don't know if I had time to input the actual picture of the third page, but I'm going to pause this and see if it's in here. Okay, it looks like I did get to put this in before my computer started not responding. So I'll just read through this here after I've already done the summary. But I think reading it through a couple of times, or at least once, to get a sense of what he's saying again, in case you've read it a long time ago and you just want a refresh. Here's page 3. You know what? I think I had my book at home ready to read how this began, but I think he's talking about how whenever we attribute our frustration, aggression, devotion, or lust to the person or situation that exists as the proximal cause of such agitation, he's saying we are not thinking objectively. And so that's just the sentence that carried over to this page, which I can't reference right now because I don't have my book. It's at home. But I'll continue reading now, because now we are fully on page 3. We are not yet, quote, objective, even in our most clear-headed moments, and thank God for that. I thought this was an interesting little parenthetical he puts, and thank God for that. Does that seem like someone who is a Jungian? Would a Jungian write that? You know, virtually every time Jung talks about God, he says the God image. And Jung explicitly says and explains that he's never talking about the metaphysics of there being a God. He's talking about the psychological aspect of it. And so he put that as God image. Now, interestingly enough, in the passage I read in that Jordan Alchemist Peterson video, Sam Dogma Harris is the full title, because I have a previous alchemy video that, you know, it's just the beginnings of thinking about what I was trying to express. And this one is, I think, it's a more fleshed out version of that. But in that quote that I read from Aeon, Jung does say God and not God image. I think he says it 1 time or 2 times, but it's the only 1 or 2 times I've ever really seen Jung, particularly in that book or in volume 9 of the collected works, parts 1 and 2, that he ever says plainly the word God and not God image. So just for your reference, for Jung to say that there, it's interesting. It's worth a read and a listen to see, was Jung talking actually about a metaphysical God there? I think maybe he was, considering he's had out-of-body experiences and sort of, you know, especially when he had a heart attack, he had visions and stuff that seems to me to lead him to believe that there is a spiritual world, not just a materialist world. Anyway, so for Jordan to say, thank God for that, it seems very interesting to me. It seems like it's not something a Jungian would say, or someone who merely believes in a Jungian conception of God. It seems like it's not something a coy atheist would say, someone who is perhaps shy about admitting that he's an atheist for whatever reason. And this gets into this video I'm doing about Peterson's belief in God and the resurrection of Jesus and his answers for those. It's a very complicated video, and it's sort of a spiritual successor to my metaphor and epistemology video. And like I said, that video was just scratching the surface. I'm going to do an official second part to that video, and probably a 3rd and 4th installment. But this video I'm working on now about Peterson's beliefs in a God or the resurrection of Jesus. This statement sort of fits into that. It's a complicated video, so I thought I would get it out today or yesterday. But it's just too complicated to put together in such a short amount of time, because I started getting the idea for it on Friday or Thursday, and I thought I could just whip it up and put it out, but it's actually a lot more complicated than I first imagined. Anyway, I'll continue on here, reading the 3rd page. We become immediately immersed in a motion picture or a novel, and willingly suspend disbelief. This is interesting. This came up, I believe Brett Weinstein came up with that in one of those first 2 debates, where Sam Harris was saying that it's sort of, people can't just choose to believe something that's unbelievable. And Weinstein brought up the point that when we go into a movie and watch a movie, or we sit down and read a novel, or go see a play or whatever, we sort of have an ability to suspend disbelief, and it works in our favor. And I thought it was a very interesting point. And here you see it's right on page 3 of Maps of Meaning. It seems like Peterson was well prepared for these debates, 30 plus years ago when he was writing this book. So I'll repeat that. We become immediately immersed in a motion picture or a novel and willingly suspend disbelief. We become impressed or terrified despite ourselves, in the presence of a sufficiently powerful cultural figurehead, an intellectual idol, a sports superstar, a movie actor, a political leader, the Pope, a famous beauty, even our superior at work. He sort of gives a lot of examples right there of what he's talking about. So, in the presence, that is, of anyone who sufficiently embodies the oft implicit values and ideals that protect us from disorder and lead us on. I think that last part's a little bit an odd way of putting it, but in any case, like the medieval individual, we do not even need the person to generate such affect. The icon will suffice. We will pay vast sums of money for articles of clothing worn or personal items used or created by the famous and infamous of our time. And again, that was brought up in the Harris and Peterson debates. The, quote, natural, pre-experimental or mythical mind is in fact primarily concerned with meaning, which is essentially implication for action and not with objective nature. I'll read that again. The pre-experimental, natural, or mythical mind is in fact primarily concerned with meaning, which is essentially implication for action and not with objective nature. The formal object, as conceptualized by modern scientifically oriented consciousness, might appear to those still possessed by the mythic imagination if they could see, quote, see it at all as an irrelevant shell, as all that was left after everything intrinsically intriguing had been stripped away. And this goes back to those people in the Amazon untouched from the modern world. You know, what would they see if they could see it at all? The formal object, I'll read that sentence again, this is a long sentence, and I'll read it without pausing. The formal object as conceptualized by modern scientifically oriented consciousness might appear to those still possessed by the mythic imagination, if they could see it at all, as an irrelevant shell, as all that was left after everything intrinsically intriguing had been stripped away. For the pre-experimentalist, the thing is most truly the significance of its sensory properties, as they are experienced in subjective experience, in affect or emotion. And in truth, in real life, to know what something is still means to know two things about it: its motivational relevance and the specific nature of its sensory qualities. And these are important points, so I'm going to read them again. For the pre-experimentalist, the thing is most truly the significance of its sensory properties as they are experienced in subjective experience, in affect or emotion. And in truth, in real life, to know what something is still means to know two things about it: its motivational relevance and the specific nature of its sensory qualities. The two forms of knowing are not identical. Furthermore, experience and registration of the former necessarily precedes development of the latter. There's the hierarchy of knowing. Something must have emotional impact before it will attract enough attention to be explored and mapped in accordance with its sensory properties. Those sensory properties, of prime import to the experimentalist or empiricist, are meaningful only insofar as they serve as cues for determining specific affective relevance or behavioral significance. We need to know what things are, not to know what they are, but to keep track of what they mean, to understand what they signify for our behavior. And I thought that sentence was a little bit difficult, so I'm going to read it again. We need to know what things are, not to know what they are, but to keep track of what they mean. So this is where I think I input the word merely, because this does not quite make too much sense to me. We need to know what things are, not merely to know what they are, but to keep track of what they mean, to understand what they signify for our behavior. It has taken centuries of firm discipline and intellectual training, religious, proto-scientific, and scientific, to produce a mind capable of concentrating on phenomena that are not yet or are no longer immediately intrinsically gripping, to produce a mind that regards real as something separable from relevant. Alternatively, it might be suggested that all the myth has not yet vanished from science, devoted as it is to human progress, and that it is this non-trivial remainder that enables the scientist to retain undimmed enthusiasm while endlessly studying his fruit flies. And I thought that was a great point. It's a very interesting point, very necessary thing to understand, especially when you have to talk to people like Matt Dillahunty and Sam Harris. So finally, this last paragraph, he gets close to going. A lot of it is moving into the 4th page, and I want to save that for next week. Hopefully my computer will be put together and back in order. But so I think I can read the first couple of sentences without getting into that. So how precisely did people think not so very long ago before they were experimentalists? What were things before they were objective things? These are very difficult questions. The things that existed prior to the development of experimental science do not appear valid either as things or as the meaning of things to the modern mind. And that's where I'm going to stop the reading of this 3rd page, because the rest of it kind of carries right on to the 4th. But that's about as much as I got for the 3rd page of Maps of Meaning. I think it's getting more clear. I think the beginning he had to kind of set the stage and set the table, so to speak. And now he's kind of moving along with things that you're already primed to understand. You know, we understand the idea of the world as a forum for action and a place of things, and how you need to have both of these things to have a coherent worldview. And now he's just putting things in these boxes, and he's allowing us to, you know, play the game at this table that he has set. And I can't wait to get on to pages, you know, more significant things further on in the book, because these are just, you know, the beginnings of it. So I'm just going to say a little bit about this piece I had created a couple of years ago after Peterson gave a talk at Harvard University. And this week I was putting together my slides, and I was thinking about what I can use for a thumbnail for this video. And I was actually looking at the cover of Maps of Meaning and putting up a picture of that. But I remembered I had this poster made. I worked with an artist, and this is not the whole poster. This is just sort of the middle part. And I'll probably get to the whole poster next week when my computer's fixed. But here I have that symbol that Peterson created. I put it as the sort of the shield emblem, sort of like his house shield emblem. And I have Peterson here sort of putting on the armor of God, if you would. He has a sword, and this I made the artist put in his wife beside him, because she plays an important role in his life's work. And he mentions her actually kind of frequently, and people sort of overlook the important role that she plays. I couldn't get a good picture of her, so I sent a screen capture to the artist, and, you know, this is about the best he can do with that screen capture. And then I have actually, when I show you the whole picture, you'll be able to see more clearly. Piaget is actually in the picture, and I put Jung over here and Nietzsche over here, and like these are the intellectual giants that he is using to fight this idea of postmodernism. And you'll see later next week when I open up the whole picture, there's actually a dragon behind them, and the dragon has many different claws here, and there's sort of strings attached to them because the dragon has a bunch of corpses, dead people, and he's sort of the puppeteer of these dead people. And the reason being is because at this Harvard talk, Peterson sort of said, don't become a dead puppet to dead ideas, something along those lines. I believe that's the exact quote. And I thought that was really cool. And like I said in a previous video, one of my best friends was sort of falling into this social justice ideology. And I could see he was no longer the person he used to be. And he was what Peterson warned us not to be, not to become dead puppets to dead ideas. And so I worked with an artist to get this put together properly. And I was pretty pleased with what the artist produced, and I just never went anywhere with it. I was going to make a poster. It's actually part of a whole story that I had in mind to make. And not to go too far off topic here, because I just wanted to say a little blurb about it, but the story I had in mind was sort of like combining the story of Paradise Lost by Milton and the story of Jordan Peterson coming into the public eye in Canada over that pronoun stuff. The idea being I would put Peterson sort of as the Abdiel character, the character that stands up to Satan and all of the angels who are willing to go on Satan's side, and calls him out for what he is and for what he's doing, and has the strength of character to sort of walk out of that that meeting Satan has with all the angels to sort of make a war in heaven. I really much I see Peterson as the Abdiel in that story, and so in the story I would have Peterson sort of as the Abdiel character. Anyway, that's sort of as much as I have for page 3, and a little blurb about this piece of artwork I had made. And hopefully my computer will get fixed soon. I'll fix it. I ordered the power supply, and I'll be up and running for a Westworld Wednesday on Wednesday. I think there's one more thing. What was it? Oh yeah, I do want to talk about this Michael Roos versus John Lennox and the Unbelievable debate. A lot of what they had to say plays into this Jordan Peterson video I'm doing about his belief in the resurrection of Jesus and God and so forth. And this is going to be very interesting. I just wanted to let you know I am going to be covering that. And again, it's sort of a spiritual successor to this video, which has been doing pretty well on my channel. If you are enjoying these Mo Meaning Mondays at all, give this video a like and subscribe. Thank you.